and welcome to Pathfinder, a podcast by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. We're joined today by one of the most influential figures of the modern space era, Lori Garver. She served not only as the head of the NASA transition team for President-elect Obama, but was also the deputy administrator of NASA from 2009 to 2013 under the Obama administration. Lori is also the co-founder of the Brooke Owens Fellowship, the founder of Earthrise Alliance, and holds a variety of board and advisor roles in the industry, which we'll get into today. On to the episode. Lori, welcome back to Pathfinder. So good to have you.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
We appreciate you taking the time. I know you're working on a lot of different things, but it's good to have you. Where are you calling in from today?
I am in Washington, Virginia, just 60 miles west of DC, a nice, safe distance. But I still have a residence on Capitol Hill as well.
So I just finished the Walter Isaacson biography on Elon Musk. And I want to tell you that it sure sounds like you were a very critical cog in some of President Obama's decisions around the future of spaceflight, at least at the time. And in 2008, according to the book, and of course your book, which we'll talk about, you advised Obama not to extend the shuttle program and let the private sector effectively take over. And I know you talk about this in your own book, Escaping Gravity. So my kind of opening question to you is, how do you think about the transformation of NASA's strategy towards commercial partnerships during your tenure compared to what it is today?
Sure. Well, it is fascinating how many people, their knowledge of my role in the SpaceX development has now come from Walter Isaacson's book, who barely touches on it. I met Walter because he did call to interview me for his book. And at that time, I asked him to write the foreword for mine. So it all worked out very well. By the
way, Lori, in that book, I have, I don't have a lot of highlights in the book, but it's funny you say that because I think it's chapter like 33, if I can even remember correctly, but I have those lines highlighted that says like, Lori did this, Lori did this, Lori did this. This is way before I knew that I was going to be chatting with you here on Pathfinder, but it was something that really stood out to me. I was like, this is really interesting. I had no idea. I was like, I need to take note of this. So even though it's not like you're in every page of the book, certainly not, but it's something that does stand out, and he writes it in a way that clearly emphasizes the impact.
Sure. And he's an authority. So people like my sister's friends reach out to her and say, hey, your sister really, and my sister's of course like, yeah, follow her on Twitter or do anything to read her own book. But sure, I don't really take issue with anything he said in it. I read the book as well. I was more looking for the tidbits on parts of his life I wasn't as familiar with, so that was fun. But as you outlined, I sort of advised at the time candidate Obama not to extend the shuttle, but to instead count on commercial. I just want to acknowledge for this audience who is a lot more knowledgeable in this area that, of course, the shuttle was already retiring. This wasn't like some big, Lori Garver said this, President Bush had put that in the plan. Mike Griffin, the head of NASA at the time of George Bush's announcement, agreed. Everybody agreed. There was an interest from, of course, shuttle contractors to continue. Therefore, there was an interest on the Hill. And there's a bit of a difference between extending one or two missions, which I was very much in favor of, and we got accomplished working in a coordinated manner with the Hill, and extending it indefinitely. It was a great hook, that conversation, because candidate Obama did ask me in the summer of 2008, would I suggest extending it? And he said he'd been getting lobbied on it by Senator Ben Nelson. So I point out to him, I think you mean Bill Nelson, and no, I don't agree. This is a setup because I had been volunteering for Hillary Clinton's campaign, and when she lost in the primary in the Obama campaign, lured me over. I wasn't as enthused to work for him, and I think that helped to be able to disagree with him. He looked at me and said, well, what do you think we should do instead? And I outlined this path that, frankly, I think NASA has been on for a long time. I was at NASA and ended up leading the policy office in the 1990s under Administrator Dan Golden. He served there for 10 years, and this was something that he absolutely believed in and drove to the extent he could at the time. And before that, I was even, I say raised by this space pirate community, which is people at the National Space Society, formerly the L5 Society, who really fundamentally have a belief, a knowledge, I would say, that we aren't going to really get very far in space development without private sector and finding ways to expand our economy outward.
Let's talk about your book. What prompted you to write the book? Because you are not afraid to tell people what you think. And your book is a very clear example of that. So tell us a little bit about, what was it during your time that, you really wanted to share your views and ideas, both towards, how NASA should be run, but also, Congress and how Congress views the space industry.
Well, I'm a little bit afraid to speak my mind. A lot of people, when the book came out, said she didn't pull any punches. That is absolutely not true. Pulled a lot of punches. It's a published document and didn't want to make derogatory assertions on people. More, it's on ideas. And to me, I wrote the book because we experienced something, certainly my career, those first 25, 30 years, I had seen and been a part of to varying degrees over that time in a revolution in aerospace. And that was not easy. It is not complete, but it is on a trajectory where I'm pretty sure it's not able to be turned back. And that not only for space was this important, and I was tired of sort of hearing about what happened from people who weren't involved in it and who were either guessing or trying to make up their own narrative. But I also think it's a blueprint for other arenas in government. It is very hard to make change, real change in government, especially, or really in any arena where people's livelihoods are based on doing things a certain way. I quote Moneyball in the book and think of it a lot in that there's just a way of doing something that's going to improve the end state goal, but in doing so will in fact break rice bowls, whatever it is that you want to say about the existing people working that field. And that is still happening in space. And that is very hurtful to some people and maybe made me the easy go-to for someone to blame. Interesting to me that has happened when you have these powerful people, companies, et cetera, who worked with me and they are revered. But that is for perhaps another book.
We eagerly await. I want to talk about COTS for a second, the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program. In your mind, how important was that for commercial space?
Really very important. COTS was not the beginning, but important when it got put through. As I said, in the 90s, when I was at NASA, Dan Golden championed and put in some programs much smaller and with companies who weren't going to, I guess, have the resources that ultimately we ended up needing for success in the company of SpaceX. But the ideas were formed earlier. And I think we needed the markets to also get through we could have been maybe successful earlier if we hadn't had the tech bubble burst the internet bubble burst really in the 2001 timeframe. But we ended up with COTS, and I give credit to the bureaucrats people don't like to give credit to at OMB for putting this in. It was under the Bush administration. It was under Mike Griffin, all of whom, in theory, were supporting the Constellation program, getting to low Earth orbit, being able to transport people and stuff to the space station. They still wanted to be government business. OMB pushed this and they accepted it because it was a small dollar thing. And we did have some companies interested in buying for the topic, but most of the people who did that are very open that it was sort of a backup plan. And obviously, it became much more important than that. I think that Constellation was not going to work, and most of the community who knew a lot more about it than I did felt that way. So COTS became Plan 1. SpaceX did successful. Luckily, Orbital Sciences, as a number 2, did a good job as well after they had to roll out Kistler out of the program when they didn't make it. Without COTS, there would have been no commercial crew.
Right. Now, at the time of launch of the program, how much of the agency was supportive of it, do you think? Was it generally and widely supported, or was it a little bit more controversial at the time?
I wish Mike Griffin had thought about me in a way where we could have talked about that, but I was not at NASA inside at the time. I know it was controversial externally only a little bit. Again, low dollars and not seen as threatening. If you're getting, $4 to $5 billion a year to go to and from the space station at that time, Ares 1 and Orion, or how much you really going to take seriously this couple $100 million that's going to this internet guy?
Yep.
Not so much. Not so much.
Yep.
I think they didn't really believe it was going to work. As it began to get more serious, as Ares 1 and Orion began to be more delayed, they were planning then to deorbit space stations. So where would the market even be for COTS? It wasn't a serious effort, but it was brilliant. It was critical. And COTS D, being the section of their proposal that only SpaceX responded to, expanded that to allowing them to carry people. And that ultimately was where I decided to bend my pick. And I think something that became much more difficult at NASA, because that really is the holy grail of NASA's flying people to space. Our astronauts are our most precious. And you'd think that might be $10 billion satellites, but going to and from space station with stuff when we already had the Soyuz, I think the NASA people just thought, well, we'll still be flying Soyuz until NASA goes with Ares and Orion.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about sort of this thread of, I think what COTS kind of laid out, or the foundation that it laid out. And let's talk a little bit more about the internet guy. So fast forwarding today, right? So we have Artemis program, right? We're in the middle of the Artemis program. I guess let's start with the SLS. Right? It's a topic of conversation that comes up very often, both internally at Payload, but also amongst our folks and colleagues that we speak to pretty regularly, which is, as the SLS. How do you think it should be utilized right now? Should it be scrapped? Maybe we can even start there. Like, is the SLS part of the future of Artemis?
I have been one, if not the only people who has been very open about my views. The SLS should not have been developed. It was done under my watch. I'm embarrassed about it. I felt sick as it was happening because I could see it all. It was obvious industry who were going to build it were lying about what they would be able to do, for how much, and how long it would take. That has exceeded my worst nightmares. And here we are, still being funded. So would I cancel it now? I'm not at NASA. I'm not somebody in a position to know where we can take SLS. Public documents, it can only go every 2 years. We haven't even flown it again since the test flight. Now there's going to be another year and a half at least before we can. We talk about, well, with SLS, we can maybe do Artemis like Apollo. No, actually not. We flew to the moon a couple times a year for 5 years. I think we went 15 times with Saturn V the first 5 years. So no, we'd only get to go 2 in that same period of time. So Apollo would be a dream. It's not capable of doing that. I have to add, a lot of wonderful people have worked on it. It has been described by the NASA people themselves as a jobs program. It created jobs. I would just say, real job creators are those things where markets can expand, where you can lower the costs and do things in a way that's really driving technology. Was it a spectacle? Will it be wonderful if we eventually do land people on the moon? Sure, but we're not doing that with SLS. SLS and Orion have taken the lion's share of the Artemis budget, and they're the easiest part. I think that's a shame.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you sort of answered my next question, which was going to be absent of players like SpaceX, which we'll talk about in a second. Could the program scale in its current format without, for example, SpaceX beyond what we did during Apollo? But it sounds like you don't think that we would. I mean, I know the whole Artemis program is built on this idea that, we're going back to the moon because we want to stay there and we want to figure out a way to build a permanent base there. And how do we use it, eventually to explore the outer planets? But it doesn't sound like you think that we can even do that with just our current infrastructure or the current plan.
Well, I don't think it's debatable. It's not just what I think. NASA's best case is once a year. They're not close to getting that, and that's not close to providing what we would need. So Starship's the key. Starship is not an operational system, and yet its goals are so much more grand than SLS. It alone is required for us to be able to go even to land on the moon. Taking separate than that, now we have a second competitor, but it's funny that people do focus on SLS and Orion, I think, when they can't get us to land on the moon. And the lander suits, they were all things that early on I'd say, why are we spending all this money doing this? We don't have a mandate to go somewhere. So then they just want the mandate. Okay, but we haven't developed all the things we need to do when we get there. And these were not maximized for really anything but, I think, getting continued funding. And so you get a lot of people, smart people. I read articles. They say, SLS is the best program going. And they argue it's gotten this much money. Same with Orion. Let's put them together. Equal opportunity basher. That you haven't achieved anything.
Right.
It's been how many years and how much money you count it all, 30, $40 billion, 10, 15 years, again, depending on when you count. Orion started getting funding in 2005. No, it doesn't get you a sustainable program, but it does get you a big NASA budget, some supporters who are in key positions, and the industry's real fired up. And we've had presidents talk about how we're going to land people on the moon. It's not really going to do that, certainly within the period of time that people have been saying for a long time. And I think that's disingenuous, and you don't like to see that when there's a community. I've been in my whole career, and I think being straight with the American public about your tax dollar spending is usually the best way to be if you want a long, sustainable, keeping up NASA's brand. NASA's got a great brand. And how long will we go without delivering on this before people say, what?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the moon a little bit more, which is from the perspective of just last week, we did have an American company land a lander on the moon, although on its side. What do you think about CLPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, right? NASA's attempt to allow the commercial industry to develop its own lander system for cargo and payloads to the moon. What are your thoughts on CLPS, and do you think it's been successful so far?
Yeah, Eclipse was created after I was there, and remember first reading about it, thinking that was really a positive step. We started a couple things, which some of them led to these companies like Google Lunar X Prize, becoming Eclipse. So it's a way of doing things that I support. I love that there is some success here in the first couple of missions with the landing, and I think the community's been really supportive, which I love. Getting things out of the science here is probably the next step. I mean, learning to go is fine. I'm a little uncomfortable with how we characterize it. NASA says they have nothing to do with it. It's commercial. But then that was, of course, the previous one that didn't work. Now it's NASA. $100 million isn't nothing for each of these to be spent, but I think it is a good approach. I would say it is successful, and that this landing, you cannot argue that. Well, some people argue, I suppose. I would argue that landing on the lunar South Pole for $100 million with a private sector robotic spacecraft is a win. I think that's a win. I think it's successful. I am thrilled with the coverage it's getting. I congratulate Steve Altemus, who I know, but part of the fun of what's happening now is a lot of these folks who are at NASA with me have now, and maybe they weren't that supportive of the concepts in the beginning, but they're seeing it and they're starting these companies and they're being successful. Look at Axiom and Seferdini. Same man. I can remember having arguments with him. Heck, versus at SpaceX. Mike LA is flying all these things. These were not people who agreed with me in the beginning. And, I am thrilled. I'm thrilled with their success. And that's when you can tell an idea when I said it's probably on a trajectory that won't return. It's not that I am thrilled that we're spending the majority of NASA's budget on the old way and on programs that aren't really of as high a value, but I am thrilled with these successes. And I think CLPS is still got a lot to come, and that's going to give us a better read on how to go about this in the future. But again, it really does owe its origins to the Dan Golden era in the 1990s. Build a little, test a little, fly a little. These were faster, cheaper, better. Those were discredited with a couple of early failures, and I would hate to see this round of ideas like this discredited, because over the longer term, it's bound to be the thing that succeeds.
Right. Well said. Let's go back to SpaceX for a second. SpaceX is the dominant launch provider. There's no question. I don't think anyone argues that.
To SpaceX.
Exactly. How does NASA view? How do you believe NASA? And I understand that obviously you're not part of the agency now, but from your vantage point, how do you think NASA views SpaceX's dominance in launch? Is that concentration something that NASA views as problematic?
Oh, yeah, right. I'm not at NASA, and there's tens of thousands of people at NASA who have different views. There are people at NASA who are so thrilled that SpaceX is there. They recognize the value that they have brought. Their missions have a chance of being flown, and they have budget because it isn't hundreds of millions to launch again. So plenty of good feelings about SpaceX. Is there nervousness in that they don't have a direct competitor? Sure. I think people are cheering for potential competitors. I'd like to see Boeing actually develop their Starliner in a way that they could be flying astronauts to and from space station. Same with Dream Chaser. I think lots of people would like to see that for different reasons. NASA chose SpaceX with Starship to be in its Artemis architecture. So by design, NASA has to be rooting for SpaceX. And I loved it when it happened because it just put them in right there in it. And it was surprising because I think it's one of these crazy decisions that, okay, you need SpaceX to succeed in Artemis with Starship. And if Starship does succeed, you don't need the parts that you've invested $40 billion in. So I haven't really seen NASA acknowledge that. And like I said, we've got another lander competitor now. So there might be some people hoping that Starship doesn't work and Blue is who ultimately lands on the moon, but the disruption of SpaceX on the Falcon 9 and then Falcon Heavy side hopefully pulled a lot of NASA people with it, and there's a lot of excitement. With this, of course, SpaceX becomes the big dog, and they're going to take arrows. They're going to get cocky. They're going to be rude. They're going to try and bully people. We've all seen it and heard it. It's something that I have said, and I said in the book, the reason SpaceX keeps winning is because they deliver. They constantly deliver. And if they keep doing that, how can NASA not be thrilled? That's what you need. And sure, we'd love competition, and that'll show the model works. But boy, in the meantime, thank goodness for them.
What do you think NASA's future will be in human spaceflight? And I don't mean this year, next year. I mean in the next decade or 2 decades from now.
Well, one of the reasons I have aired my concerns about the path with SLS and Orion is I do think we put at risk our human spaceflight future, our NASA brand. But over the long term, I think the future is bright. I do believe that there is so much positive to come from our ventures into space. A lot of that is with satellites and communications and remote sensing and the things I care about here on Earth that are benefited by space. But will humans go back to the moon and ultimately land on Mars? I absolutely think they will. And I do not fear that NASA won't be a part of those missions. I don't know what role they will play, but I think they will be a part of them. And in many ways, there'll probably be other space agencies, international space agencies involved as well.
So I'm going to ask what will be probably my most controversial question of the day. So back in the Apollo era, we had two space programs. Today, we have nearly 80 globally. Do you think that there's a scenario that NASA, combined with what's happening in commercial space, risks losing relevance?
It's the very question is something that I tend to try to take on, which is, well, if you're not relevant, then it doesn't really matter. NASA maybe hasn't been relevant in the sense that it was when it was formed, because it was formed to show military might against the Soviet Union. So did we stay relevant after the fall of the Soviet Union? NASA for NASA's sake isn't what we should be about, given that it's publicly funded. NASA for advancement of United States interests, and in my view, those are national security, sort of a global leadership kind of roles. It is more, though, about driving, I think, technologies and economic advancement. That's how we compete today on the international stage. And NASA does risk being less relevant if they aren't really pushing the boundaries of science, technology, innovation, and opening the frontier to new markets and that kind of thing. So yes, it does give me a little bit of concern. And it's the reason I am willing to be outspoken, because I really believe that it's sort of, I have compared it before to if you love someone and they're an alcoholic. You don't just keep serving them drinks because be around when they're drinking. You work for a cure, and I love NASA, and I love the people, and I have spent over 10 years of my career there, both 5 years in the 90s and then later from 2009 to 13. And these are things that we should not take for granted.
So I love that you brought up the thread of NASA's relevance during a time, especially in the Apollo era, when we were effectively using the agency as a Cold War instrument, right? I think you've mentioned that once before, especially during the Apollo era, to sort of demonstrate the superiority of democracy, which was all fine and good, but it led to this like very skewed culture towards military. Now, on one hand, it did create political coordination to a level that we haven't seen before, or we rarely see. But how do you think great power competition affects NASA? And right now, a lot of folks would argue that we have an adversary that is equal to, if not greater, than what we saw in the Apollo era. How do you think that that's going to affect NASA's perspectives on what we're doing in the industry now?
We hear NASA's leadership use that as a drive. I think it's more for human spaceflight than other areas that they want to take on. I don't love the rhetoric. We got to beat China to the moon. First of all, we've been to the moon. We won the race. This is now a race for the 13th person. But since we've been putting it out there as a race, you bet we better win it. I again think that you win these great power things through different means, and Apollo for its time was miraculous. It was a brilliant thing to take on. It was risky, and as you said, it brought together this collective that has unmatched. And going back to the moon hasn't done that. Why would it? A goal from 50 years ago. Neil deGrasse Tyson was the one who called it Apollo necrophilia, I think, first. We should be doing things differently. We should be taking on new challenges that align with our problems today and global leadership. And again, I'm a fan of humans returning to the moon if it's done in a way that is advancing our technologies, the state of the art, the economy, doing things that allow United States to continue to be this great nation. We're betting that this one thing that really did coalesce not only our political system, but our industrial might and so forth can happen again. And I think we're missing the real lesson of Apollo. Let's face it, it's been 55 years. I've been, I think, at 4 at least presidential speeches where they said, we're going back to the moon. Like, it didn't happen then. The 2024 deadline's obviously not happening. I don't know that a date and a deadline for something you did 55 years ago is really the way to compete, whether that's a great power competition or not. But you bet I want us to win now that we've said it.
Yeah. Well, are there any policy changes that you're championing, or you want to see from the current NASA administration or from Congress right now that's particularly top of mind?
Oh, sure. I would do lots of things differently. I'm sure. I just have a different take on the goals, I think. And so to me, you'd have to look at this as what are the things today that, like 15 years ago was the case with launch, that really need some investment or some regulatory reform or some government action that will advance U.S. interests. And I think from the vantage of air and space. And it's not my job to think about that hard anymore. But I don't think that's how people look at it. And I think we have lost some of our head start. I still think we are absolutely number one in space, but I think this paradigm shift that it took to bring about SpaceX's success in government is something we need more of across the board.
I want to go back to the early days, Lori. What prompted you to work in the industry and pursue this path of both championing commercial space, but also being impactful within the public sector?
My story is a little different than most. I did not grow up wanting to be an astronaut. I know that one of the things I do, I don't know if you're going to ask about it, I lead a fellowship for women in collegiate aerospace programs, and it's called the Brooke Owens Fellowship. a high percentage of these people grew up wanting to be an astronaut. And, I didn't. We didn't have any women astronauts when I grew up. Sally Ride didn't fly until I had graduated from college. But I tell the story in the book, as were girls my age in the 60s and 70s, actively discouraged from STEM fields. So I was political science and economics major. I was very interested in making a positive difference to humanity. I think most people, young idealistic people, have this view. And I came to Washington to make a difference. People said you go to New York to make money and Washington to make a difference. And I worked for John Glenn on his presidential campaign in 1983. For those of you who weren't born then, John Glenn, after orbiting the Earth as the first American, had his own political career and was a U.S. senator, ran for president. And this was Reagan's, what ultimately was his second term election. We didn't get out of Super Tuesday on the John Glenn committee, but I'll tell you what, I met people who worked at NASA who looked out for the young folks on the campaign, applied for and got an entry-level job at a place called the National Space Institute. It was founded by Dr. Werner von Braun in 1974, and it was an advocacy organization that supported NASA, basically. We merged with the L5 Society, which was much more of this grassroots, wanting to settle space, wanting to expand the economic sphere into space. And I worked there for 14 years before the head of NASA at the time, Dan Golden, called me up and said, I think I could use you more inside than out now. I had spent those 14 years really advocating on behalf of a better future in space. And if you look at some of the testimony I gave to Congress back then in the 80s and 90s, it's amazing. I wouldn't change a word. We talked about all the things that were absolutely critical to being in place before we could have a success like SpaceX. You talked about Walter Isaacson's book. My favorite part is he says the last place you want to be is between Elon Musk and taking full credit for something. And so far be it from me to say Elon Musk doesn't get full credit for something. But honestly, without all these people that came before and me being there to fight the good fight, the people who are supporting this now, had they been successful, we wouldn't have the program. So keep that in mind when there's new battles, and I'm in some ways, seen as this lightning rod, I don't know, polarizing individual for really working, because I didn't just personally want to make myself the center of this and be an astronaut, and my goal wasn't self-fulfilling in that way. I was driving to a program that I thought really could lift up society, and I think it does. I think most people recognize that. But when that's your motive, that's your end state goal, rather than I want to get to space myself, it tends to lead to some different decisions.
Right. Well, no one can question what you've done for the industry. So we're glad you made the decisions you've made. So I'll say that. Now, I want to talk about what you're working on today. So you are a member of a few different companies, both as board members in some cases and some as advisors. So companies like K2, Hydrosat, Sierra Space, Worldview. How do you decide? Given what you know and how long you've been in the industry, how do you decide what companies you want to work with? What do you look for in these types of partnerships? There might be plenty of people listening saying, "How do we get Lori involved with us?" Like, what are you looking for?
Well, I think one, it can be seen as a positive or negative to have your views be known and be somebody who has been maybe a maverick. I know at least one of those companies, that's their favorite thing about me, is that you don't get asked really by companies who don't want someone who's going to speak their mind. So that's a nice self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, like anyone at my point in their career, I guess it's SpaceX who had the no asshole motto. That would certainly be one for me. But I take it even further. I want to be at a place where it's of benefit, that I can offer something that is really gonna help, and that they're doing something that I really feel is going to be positive for society. That's truly not that limiting in space. There are so many places that do this, but I don't really turn down that much. I don't know how else to say it. So of course, you have conflicts. You get involved with or on a board, and then that means you really can't take someone else on in that specific space. But otherwise, it's a quite fulfilling portfolio of places and people where I feel I can continue to make a difference.
You also serve as a operating advisor, if I have that title correct, at Bessemer Venture Partners, and we did have Tess on our last episode, and she's great, and she's a huge supporter and fan of you. But I'm curious, now that you sort of have this sort of quasi investor hat on at times, are there any emerging technologies that you are looking at, thinking about, or waiting to see that you think could be game changers for NASA and its future missions?
Yes. Well, Tess reached out to me for Bessemer because I had spoken at, I think when she was in grad school at Stanford, to her class. That's always really, really fun. And now she's this, rock star, venture capital person in deep tech. I would like to associate my remarks with hers. And I know she was just on your show, and I'll just add there also Casey Hanmers, who was just on your show. Those are both great episodes. I'll pitch for your listenership. You note with Bessemer, you haven't seen a lot of investments recently in deep tech and the commercial space side. They just did announce their defense tech advisory board that I am on. I helped with their analysis of that. So I am bullish on some of those. It's great to see, when you asked why the book, a reason being, I think what we did at NASA successfully can help in other areas, specifically, obviously, military space is one of those. And I do believe that we have some people in important positions today who are really interested in taking those lessons and helping our national security space. And so there's going to be some things there that I think are very important. But in general, I am bullish on those things where you can see there's a market, and we always do more with comms. Always. There's always going to be more ways that we can utilize information about the Earth. You just think of the fidelity that we've advanced in the last couple of years, use of machine learning. I mean, at some point, we have the data that hasn't even been analyzed. Put a business together for that. As a space business, again, I'm more about the end state than saying this is good because I built something that went to space. Let's utilize it. I mean, transportation was only about lowering the cost so all the brilliant minds can really innovate to figure out how we utilize that environment beyond our own atmosphere to our best vantage. And I'm super excited about anybody who's investing in ways that are going to help us do that. So it can be things like orbital debris, and we need to preserve our ability to operate in these environments. That is something that is a real life problem that should be invested in. I see some of the more long-term things as how wonderful that we have these very wealthy individuals who are willing to do it, but I'm not sure I see the private sector coming either to the moon or certainly Mars beyond these billionaire angel investors whose visions are aligned with doing that. But ultimately, where you can reduce cost and improve your capability, that's a positive thing. And I think, like any investor, you're going to look at the team, you're going to look at what they have to do. Is it a rational, helpful thing where there will be a market and government are out? And I've been doing that my whole life without realizing that's what it was. So it's been a fun partnership at Bessemer.
So, you were involved in NASA's asteroid redirect mission, and this is not. My question isn't quite about that, but I'm curious. Given you did work on that project, what is your view on the startups today that are pursuing asteroid mining as a business model? Now, this has been something that has been pursued a number of times in the past. Unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons, whether it's business model or timing, many companies did not work out in this field. But there are that doesn't stop folks from trying. And there's a number of well-funded businesses today that are pursuing asteroid mining as a business model. What do you think about asteroid mining? I don't know if you've spent any time on the area, but just curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah. So in general, my interest in asteroids, I come by for all the obvious reasons. If you're looking at something that you can do that really would have value for humanity, I looked at asteroids as something that three main things it can do for us. It can keep us from going away the dinosaurs just by doing more with tracking and some of these tests like we've recently seen that were started in my day. Really exciting stuff, how we could learn to potentially defend our planet. Secondly is science. Ultimately, we know that perhaps the very seeds of life came to us from space on a comet. Or third, that as we go out in space, the resources in asteroids will be fundamental to a sustainable future. That's a multi-generational aspect of this. And we hope that the part about keeping us from getting hit is multi-generational as well, although the sooner the better, because you never know. Really, I think that asteroid redirect mission became such it was politicized for no reason, both big P and little p, because the aerospace community was fixated really on Constellation and the moon because they saw that as being the hook to getting more money. And we suggested an asteroid because you could do it without an expensive lunar lander. What I find hilarious about this now is the lander's not at all the most expensive part of the equation in today's infrastructure plans. But I think that manufacturing for asteroids is something that will ultimately be meaningful. And I am bullish on it over the longer term. I'm not sure how long that will be. I mean, it's similar to the moon. I don't know if you've read or talked to, you should really have the book is called Cities on Mars. And they talk about some of the more visionary, shall we say, approaches that the space community has for settling and colonizing space. And sometimes we say things, and I found this even the other day, oh, we've landed on the South Pole. All of a sudden, we're going to be using lunar regolith to make habitats. Okay, few steps in between. Few steps in between. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue it.
One more question. It's a two-part question, and it's a prediction. So, Lori, you get to make $2 million bets. And those bets are when we land on the moon next, and if we're going to be next, or will it be another country? How would you place those two bets?
easy that it will be us. I believe we can make it by 2030.
Boots on the ground by 2030.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, then actually, sorry, I wasn't going to ask you a 3-part question, but when do you think Mars?
Crystal ball gets a little more cloudy for that, but presuming you've been developing Starship and not wasted all your money on SOS Orion, we're able to wind those down when Starship is operational. If Starship is operational, that ought to be something that becomes a priority. Getting to Mars could certainly be done. I used to really know those best years because we even looked at them, and there's a couple in the 30s. I certainly think in the 30s, when we were working on President Obama's speech about this, we settled on, and I'm going to be around to see it. So I'll go with that.
All
and
right.
I'm 62.
Fair enough. All right. Last question. And I know I said that the previous one was my last question, but this is actually my last question. What do you do for fun? You've been in very highly stressful roles in your career. What have you done that's just like, how do I get my mind off of these things sometimes? Like any hobbies, anything that you really kind of you've gravitated to outside of space?
Well, I have always had love. I say this and said it for at least 50 something years. I'm happiest when I'm dancing.
Oh, wow.
I just loved dance. I used to do ballet and tap and all that growing up, but it's never left me. In fact, for the last Brooke Owens Fellowship summit last summer, I choreographed a flash mob and had all the Patty Gray Smith and Brooke Owens fellows up on stage with me. I'd sent around the video of me doing it, and we did it to Moby, We Are All Made of Stars. You will see, I have a big smile, and I'm told a lot I smile too much. I shouldn't if I'm going to be taken seriously. That's why for my NASA portrait, you see this very serious face. But I am happiest when I'm dancing. But I love hiking. I love all sports. I'm a huge sports nut, mainly doing them, but I also tend to like to watch them. I have a couple of kids who are now late 20s, early 30s. One is extremely musical. And so I do enjoy singing, but I am happier dancing while he's playing his music. I am writing a space musical with my son called Space Age. It's going to be on Broadway. So
that's amazing.
Get ready. It's about the arc that we've talked about today. And my book, I reserved with my publisher the rights for the live theater. And of course, they're laughing like, yeah, sure, lady, no one's going to make a musical about your life, but they didn't know. Oh yeah, and the book really pulled it out of me, a creative side that I think all of us have. So it's fun to do both.
When is that musical set to release?
Well, we have a lot of work to do, and every week more things come up that we want to add. So we're going to have to, musicals take a long time. And actually my son proposed last week that, in prep for this, maybe we should do a podcast, but I don't really think I intend to do that because, I think it would take from this big overall thing. I mean, I'm sitting here, I've got my whole space age, this is for musicals. You start with your I Want song, and you go into all of this. And we use aliens. I'm just going to acknowledge that right now because musicals need a way to move the story along. And so we're going to have a couple aliens come and visit us and help us. They want to see what it is that we are up to because all of a sudden we are launching a lot more often than we used to. How did that ever happen? Imagine that.
What well, I will tell you, once you get closer and closer to it being finished, completed, we'd love to have you back on. For those who know me, I'm a huge music guy, huge music guy. I've produced, I've performed. That's for another conversation, another day. But no, we would love to talk. We'd love to talk a little bit about your journey through working on that, because I'm sure it's very, very hard, arguably harder than your role at NASA. So
yes. And so also there's this whole mother-son aspect to it. My son doing the creative, but he's really pulling me out as the subject matter expert. And so the process has just been joy.
Hey, what's the song or artist that gets you out of your seat and dancing?
Oh, well, I'm totally obsessed, as the nation is, with Taylor Swift right now. But I've been, the man, I quote her in the book. I say, if I was riding a Tesla out to my Dragon launch, I would sure want to hear some Taylor Swift singing about what is it like to have everyone think everything you do is so perfect.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'm adding some Taylor to the playlist for our tiki bar party at Symposium. So hopefully we see you with your dancing shoes on.
The man. Yep. Okay.
There you go. Lori, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a pleasure as always, and looking forward to having you back again sometime soon. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.